In 1943, an envelope arrived at the home of an 83-year-old man in Battle Creek, Michigan. The man was completely blind. He had lost his sight 6 years earlier to glaucoma, and since then, everything that came to him from the written world had to be read aloud by someone else. Letters reports board meeting minutes. All of it passed through another person's voice before it reached him. But not this one. This envelope he set aside. He did not ask anyone to open it. He did not ask anyone to read it. He simply left it where it sat, and he waited. The letter was from his older brother, the same brother who for 25 years had made him run alongside a bicycle with a notebook, ready to record whatever thought might strike the great man while he pedaled around the grounds. The same brother who had expected him to stand outside a bathroom door pen in hand, taking dictation while the employer sat on the toilet. The same brother who had required him his own blood, his own family to address him not as John, not as brother, but always formally as Dr. Kellogg. The man holding that envelope had spent 25 years as his brother's servant. Then he had spent the next 37 building one of the most successful food companies in American history, putting his signature on breakfast tables across the world. He had won a landmark legal battle for the right to his own family name. He had given away $66 million to help children he would never meet. And now his brother, dying at 91, had finally written to say he was sorry. The envelope stayed sealed. How does a man build an empire and still find himself unable to open one letter? To answer that, you have to go back to the very beginning, to a small city in Michigan that believed with complete sincerity that the world was about to end. Act 1. The town that waited for the end of the world. Battle Creek, Michigan, in the 1860s, was not an ordinary American town. While the rest of the country was recovering from the Civil War and chasing industrial fortunes, this small city in the southwestern corner of the state had become the spiritual headquarters of a religious movement with an unusual conviction the second coming of Christ was imminent, and the human body needed to be prepared for it. The Seventh-day Adventists had gathered in Battle Creek by the thousands. They observed the Sabbath on Saturday rather than Sunday. They rejected meat, alcohol, tobacco, coffee, and tea. They believed the body was a temple that had to be kept pure for the Lord's return. This was not casual faith. It was a way of organizing every detail of daily life, every meal, every habit, every hour of the week. Into this community, a broom maker named John Preston Kellogg had settled with his family. John Preston and his wife Annette would have 16 children together. 6 of them died from infectious diseases before they reached adulthood. The children who survived grew up in an atmosphere of intense religious devotion, constant anxiety about physical health, and the ever-present awareness that death could arrive without warning, and that the world beyond this one was the only destination that truly mattered. John Harvey Kellogg was born into this family on February 26, 1852. He contracted tuberculosis as a child, leaving his left lung largely useless for the rest of his life. But what he lacked in physical strength he made up for with a quality of mind that the Adventist church elders noticed early. They saw potential in this boy. They decided to invest in it. They sent him to study at the Hygeo Therapeutic College in New Jersey, then to the University of Michigan Medical School, and finally to Bellevue Hospital Medical College in New York City. When John Harvey returned to Battle Creek in 1876 as a fully credentialed physician, he was 24 years old, and the church had a job waiting for him. Will Keith Kellogg arrived 8 years after his older brother on April 7, 1860. He was the 7th of the 16 children. From the beginning, his path diverged from John Harvey's in ways that had nothing to do with intelligence or character, and everything to do with the simple accident of being seen. Will Keith had poor eyesight. He could not read the blackboard at school. His teachers assumed he was slow. His family assumed he was dim. Nobody thought to check his vision, and so a boy who was perfectly capable of learning spent his childhood being quietly written off as the family's disappointment. It is one of the small, ordinary cruelties that history rarely records. A child misread by the people around him his potential invisible simply because nobody looked carefully enough. At 13, Will Keith dropped out of school. His father put him to work selling brooms door to door across Battle Creek. The teenager learned quickly. He learned to pitch products to skeptical housewives who had no particular interest in buying another broom. He learned to handle rejection without losing his composure or his confidence. He learned to calculate margins, manage small inventories, and read the difference between a customer who might be persuaded and one who had already decided. These were not the skills his family celebrated. There were no church elders watching his progress and planning his future. Nobody was setting money aside to send him anywhere for advanced training. But they were skills that would eventually prove more valuable than anyone standing in that household in the 1870s could have possibly imagined. John Harvey left Battle Creek for medical school. Will Keith left school for a broom route. The distance between those two paths would define the rest of their lives. But distance, it turns out, is not the same as separation. The two paths were about to converge in the most consequential way possible, inside a single building under a single roof, with one brother in charge and one brother keeping score. A seat. 2. The Servant and the Star. In 1876, 16-year-old Will Keith Kellogg walked through the doors of the Western Health Reform Institute in Battle Creek. He was not there as a patient. He was there because his brother needed someone to keep the books, manage correspondence, handle administrative details, and generally make sure that the operation ran smoothly, while John Harvey focused on the work he considered important. Will Keith needed employment. The arrangement seemed on the surface entirely natural. It would last 25 years. By the time Will Keith arrived, John Harvey had already renamed the institution the Battle Creek Medical Surgical Sanitarium. The word was his own invention, a combination of sanitary and sanatorium, and it captured exactly the atmosphere he intended to create. The San, as everyone called it, was not a hospital in the conventional sense. It was a destination, a place where the wealthy and the worried could come to be restored. The restoration worked, or seemed to. The San grew from a struggling Adventist clinic into a campus covering 30 acres with more than 30 buildings. The main structure alone could house 1,300 patients. Between 800 and 1,000 employees kept the operation running, including 30 physicians on staff. And the patients who filled those rooms were not ordinary people seeking ordinary care. Presidents came to Battle Creek. William Howard Taft, Warren G. Harding, and Calvin Coolidge all sought restoration within those walls. Thomas Edison came when his mind needed quiet. Henry Ford and Harvey Firestone escaped the pressures of their industrial empires here. Amelia Earhart arrived to prepare her body for the demands of long-distance flight. John D. Rockefeller Jr. came after the violence at Ludlow had stained his family's reputation in ways that money alone could not clean. John Harvey Kellogg presided over all of this at 5 feet 4 inches tall, dressed entirely in white suit, white shoes, white tie with a white cockatoo perched on his shoulder, and round spectacles framing a pointed beard that patients and staff never forgot. He was the most famous physician in America, and he knew it. Will Keith knew it too. He was reminded of it constantly. The daily reality of Will Keith's working life during those 25 years was a kind of sustained humiliation that is difficult to fully appreciate from a distance. He arrived before dawn and rarely left before midnight. He managed the accounts, drafted correspondence, scheduled appointments, supervised staff, and handled every administrative detail that kept the San functioning. He worked 120 hours per week. His salary remained minimal throughout. But the hours and the pay were not the worst of it. When John Harvey wanted to think through a problem while taking his morning bicycle ride around the sanitarium grounds, Will Keith ran alongside. Not rode, ran. Notebook in hand, ready to write down whatever thought might strike the great man mid-pedal. When John Harvey used the bathroom, Will Keith stood outside the door with pen and paper, taking dictation. The physician could not afford to waste even those minutes, and through all of it, Will Keith was required to address his own brother, his flesh and blood, the boy who had grown up in the same house, slept under the same roof as Dr. Kellogg. Never John, never brother, always the formal title, always the distance, always the reminder of who was the master and who was the servant. In 1884, Will Keith wrote in his diary, "I feel kind of blue. I am afraid that I will always be a poor man the way things look now." He was 24 years old. He had already worked for his brother for 8 years. He would work for him for 22 more. Consider what that means. 22 more years of running alongside the bicycle. 22 more years of standing outside the bathroom door. 22 more years of Dr. Kellogg. Rather than John, rather than brother, rather than the name his mother had given him. A man can absorb a great deal over 22 years. He can learn patience and discipline and the particular quiet endurance of someone who has decided that waiting is the only option available to him. He can also accumulate a quantity of grievance that does not dissolve when the circumstances finally change. In the meantime, a former sanitarium patient named C.W. Post had left Battle Creek and built a cereal empire worth millions from ideas he had absorbed during his stay. Dozens of cereal companies had sprung up across the city, all of them profiting from the health food craze that John Harvey's institution had created. Will Keith watched all of this from behind the accounting books, keeping meticulous records of other people's success. For 25 years, Will Keith Kellogg watched other men get rich from ideas that passed through his brother's institution. He kept the books. He wrote the letters. He ran alongside the bicycle. And he waited. The doctor's madness. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what John Harvey Kellogg actually believed about the human body. His philosophy of health began with a single conviction: 90% of all human disease originated in the stomach and intestines. The solution, therefore, was straightforward: clean them out and keep them clean. Everything else at the Sound flowed from this premise, and some of what flowed from it was extraordinary by any measure. He invented an enema machine capable of pumping 15 quarts of water through a patient's bowels in a single minute. Patients received multiple enemas daily. John Harvey himself took one every morning and another at midday, which he considered essential maintenance. Water alone, however, was not sufficient. Kellogg believed the intestines needed to be populated with beneficial bacteria. His solution was yogurt administered from both directions simultaneously. Patients consumed half a pint by mouth. The remaining half was introduced from the other end by enema. The procedure was intended to establish healthy flora throughout the entire digestive tract. For patients requiring additional stimulation, there was the vibrating chair, a wooden seat that shook the body at up to 60 oscillations per second. The violent trembling was designed to promote bowel movements. It frequently succeeded immediately and involuntarily, which created its own challenges for the staff responsible for cleanup. Light therapy cabinets bathed patients in the glow of dozens of electric bulbs. Sinusoidal machines sent mild electrical currents through their bodies. Mechanical horses provided exercise for those too weakened by illness to ride real animals. President Coolidge enjoyed his sanitarium horse so enthusiastically that he had one installed in the White House. But of all John Harvey Kellogg's obsessions, none ran deeper than his views on human sexuality. He had married Ella Eaton in 1879. The marriage was never physically consummated. The couple maintained separate bedrooms throughout their entire life together. Rather than biological children, they fostered 42 orphaned children over the years and legally adopted 8 of them. Kellogg wrote about the physical relationship between husband and wife with a kind of clinical horror that suggested the subject genuinely disturbed him, and he brought that disturbance to his readers with remarkable commercial success. His books on what he called the solitary vice sold widely. Masturbation, he wrote and lectured, caused poor posture. acne weakened vision, heart palpitations, epilepsy, and eventual insanity. The preventive measures he recommended were severe. For boys, he advocated circumcision performed deliberately without anesthesia, arguing that the pain would create a useful inhibitory association in the child's mind. In severe cases, he recommended physically preventing erections through surgical means. For girls, he prescribed the direct application of carbolic acid to the clitoris. These were not ideas he kept hidden in obscure medical journals. He published them in best-selling books. He lectured on them to packed auditoriums across the country, and the entire dietary program of the San was designed at least in part around their logic. Heavy, flavorful, stimulating foods inflamed the passions and excited the body's lower impulses. Bland, simple, easily digested foods would keep the body calm and the mind elevated. This philosophy taken into the kitchen would lead directly to the invention that made the Kellogg name immortal. The San attracted patients because it worked, or seemed to. People arrived exhausted and unwell, and left feeling restored. Whether the restoration came from the treatments themselves or from the weeks of enforced rest and regular meals and freedom from the pressures of business, or simply from the powerful psychological effect of being told by a famous physician that they were being healed. None of that mattered much to the people who checked out feeling better than when they checked in. They told their friends. Their friends came. The institution grew. And Will Keith kept the books managed, the staff handled the correspondence, and watched all of it from behind a desk that his brother walked past every day without pausing. John Harvey Kellogg was, by any modern measure, a dangerous eccentric. But in 1890s, America, he was considered a genius. And somewhere in his kitchen, his younger brother was about to accidentally help invent the most important breakfast food in history. Act 4. The Accidental Invention. The Battle Creek Sanitarium needed food that was bland, easily digestible, and completely incapable of exciting any unwanted appetites in its patients. Bread satisfied some of these requirements, but the process of making it involved yeast fermentation, which John Harvey considered potentially stimulating. What he wanted was something simpler. A grain-based food that could be prepared without fermentation, eaten without much thought, and forgotten without regret. Something that would fuel the body without engaging the imagination. In the late 1880s, John Harvey and Will Keith began experimenting in the sanitarium kitchen with various grains, trying to develop foods that met these requirements. The work fell in practice largely to Will Keith. He was the one who spent hours in that kitchen testing temperatures, adjusting recipes, managing the practical details of food production, while his brother theorized. The discovery, when it came, arrived by accident. A batch of boiled wheat was left sitting too long. The exact circumstances are remembered differently in different accounts, and both brothers told versions that credited their own contribution rather more generously than the others. But the core fact is consistent across all of them. The grain was left out when it should have been processed further, and by the time anyone returned to it, it had dried out in a way that changed everything. The moisture had redistributed through each individual kernel rather than staying concentrated at the surface. When the dried grain was passed through the rollers that would normally have produced a continuous sheet of dough, something different happened. Instead of a solid ribbon of flattened wheat, the rollers produced individual flakes, separate thin, light fragments that corresponded to the individual grains. Each kernel had become its own small piece. The brothers tasted them. They were not unpleasant. They were, in fact, considerably more interesting than most of what the San's kitchen had been producing. They filed a patent for the flaking process in 1894, and the name on that patent included both brothers. When they tried the same process with corn, the results were even better. Corn flakes were lighter, crispier, and more appealing than the wheat version. Patients in the sanitarium received them at breakfast and seemed genuinely satisfied, which was more than could be said for most of what the institution had served them. Will Keith saw something in this product that his brother did not. He saw a business. He could taste the potential in those flakes, and he understood from his years of watching CW. Post and others capitalize on the Sans ideas exactly what was needed to turn a dietary supplement into a commercial product. The problem was obvious to anyone who tasted the original version honestly. It was not particularly good. It was acceptable in the way that things prescribed by physicians are acceptable. You ate it because you were supposed to, not because you wanted to. If cornflakes were going to reach American kitchens, not as a medical prescription, but as a morning staple, they needed to taste like something a person might choose freely. It needed to taste better. He began adding sugar to the recipe, then salt. He adjusted proportions, tested batches, refined the process with the same patient attention to detail he had applied for decades to his brother's accounting ledgers. The result was a cornflake that tasted like something a person might actually want to eat in the morning, rather than something prescribed by a physician to manage their intestinal health. John Harvey was appalled. This was medical food. It was not supposed to be enjoyable. Making it enjoyable was, in his view, a betrayal of the entire purpose. Two brothers, one invention. Completely opposite visions for what it could become. Something had to give. Eyesight. 5. The Liberation. On February 19, 1906, Will Keith Kellogg was 46 years old. He had worked in his brother's institution for 3 decades. He had balanced the books drafted, the letters run alongside the bicycle, and stood outside the bathroom door. He had watched other men build fortunes from ideas that circulated through Battle Creek while he recorded their movements in the Sans accounting ledgers. He had written in his diary 22 years earlier that he feared he would always be a poor man. On that February morning, he founded the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company. He bought out his brother's interest in the cereal business. For the first time in his adult life, he was working for himself. John Harvey barely noticed. The San was thriving. The cereal business had always been, in his view, a dietary tool, a minor extension of his health philosophy, not a serious commercial venture. He let his younger brother have the cornflakes and returned to his real work. Will Keith did not waste the opportunity. The first thing he did was improve the product. He added more sugar, more salt, more of everything that made cornflakes taste like something worth eating in the morning. John Harvey would have been horrified, but John Harvey was no longer in charge of the recipe. The second thing he did was something that distinguished him from almost every other manufacturer of his era. He took 1/3 of his entire startup capital and spent it on a single advertisement. The ad ran in Ladies' Home Journal and invited housewives across the country to wink at their grocer and see what they got. Grocers who received a wink were instructed to hand over a free sample box of Kellogg's cornflakes. The campaign was designed to create trial to get the product into homes that had never heard of it and let it sell itself from there. In New York City alone, sales increased 15-fold within weeks. Will Keith followed with more advertising, more promotions, and more free samples, committing to a level of marketing spending that his competitors considered reckless. He understood something fundamental that his brother had never grasped in the new century. The product that reached the most people and tasted the best would win. Health claims were secondary. Flavor was everything. And the company that spent the most telling people about its product would be the company they remembered when they stood in the grocery aisle. Then he did something that nobody else was doing. He signed his name on the front of every box, not the company name, not a brand character. His actual signature, W.K. Kellogg, printed on the packaging as a personal guarantee of quality. It was an intimate gesture in an era of industrial anonymity, and it worked precisely because it felt personal. The man who had spent 25 years being invisible was now putting his name where millions of people would see it every morning. That signature remains on Kellogg's cereal boxes to this day. John Harvey watched his younger brother's success with growing irritation. In 1908, he launched his own cereal company selling products under the Kellogg name. The argument he made to himself and to others was straightforward. The Kellogg name had meant health and medical authority for decades before Will Keith's cornflakes existed. His reputation had built that name. He had every right to use it. Will Keith filed suit to stop him. The case went through the courts for over a decade. In 1910, a settlement was reached and quickly violated. In 1916, the brothers were back before the Michigan Supreme Court. The trial lasted an entire month. Witnesses testified about the invention of cornflakes, the history of the sanitarium, the meaning of the Kellogg name in American commerce, and the question of which brother the American public associated with that name. John Harvey took the stand with the confidence of a man who had treated presidents and written best-selling books. He was the original Kellogg. He was the famous one. His younger brother was a businessman who had taken a product from his kitchen and sold it with sugar added against his explicit wishes. Will Keith presented a different argument. He had spent millions of dollars building consumer recognition for the Kellogg name in grocery stores. His signature was on every box. When an American housewife reached for cereal labeled Kellogg, she was not thinking about a physician in Battle Creek. She was thinking about the product that Will Keith had built and advertised and delivered to her kitchen. In December of 1920, the Michigan Supreme Court delivered its verdict. Will Keith won completely. He was granted exclusive rights to the Kellogg name on cereal products. John Harvey was ordered to return all profits his competing company had generated. The legal victory was absolute. After the ruling, the brothers rarely spoke. When business unavoidably required them to be in the same room, Will Keith insisted that a third party be present. He would not be alone with his brother. The man who had once been required to address his sibling as Dr. Kellogg now refused to be in the same room with him without a witness. Will Keith Kellogg had won the courtroom. He had won the marketplace. He had won everything his brother had once suggested through decades of silent condescension that he could never have. But winning it, turned out, had its own costs. Act 6. The Cottage and the Price. In 1925, Will Keith Kellogg was 65 years old and finally in a position to build something purely for himself. He chose a spot 15 miles from Battle Creek at Gull Lake in southwestern Michigan. The property sat on the highest elevation overlooking the water. 110 feet above the lake, covering 32 acres with 1,600 feet of private shoreline. He hired the architectural firm Benjamin & Benjamin from Grand Rapids and told them what he wanted, something that looked as though it had stood for centuries. They delivered a neo-Tudor masterpiece. The exterior featured authentic, half-timbered walls with stucco panels, exactly as one would find on a manor house in the English countryside. Leaded glass windows with heraldic shields caught the morning light from the lake. The roof was clad in imported Ludovici tiles, topped with terracotta chimney finials that gave the roofline a distinctly old-world character. The interior spread across 15,000 square feet of living space, with rooms designed for entertaining, for family gatherings, for the kind of easy domestic life that Will Keith had never experienced growing up. He filled the grounds to match. A Dutch windmill rose from the property, purely decorative but accurate in every detail. A greenhouse grew roses, citrus fruits, and fresh flowers year-round, supplying daily bouquets for the main house. A boathouse sat at the water's edge. A pagoda added an unexpected accent to the English landscape, as though the whole estate were assembled from everything that had ever appealed to its owner, rather than any single coherent vision. When the landscapers suggested planting young trees that would mature beautifully over the coming decades, Will Keith refused. "At my age," he told them, "you can't wait for trees to grow." He ordered fully mature trees transplanted directly onto the property. He had spent too long waiting for things to develop on someone else's timeline. He called it the Cottage. The name was either extreme modesty or a private joke, and possibly both. A 15,000 square foot Tudor manor with a windmill, a greenhouse, and a pagoda was to a man who had grown up with nothing and been told to expect nothing, simply a cottage by the lake. He said late in life that as a boy he had never learned to play. The Adventist household had left no room for frivolity. The sanitarium had left no time. Now he watched his grandchildren run across the lawns and splash in the lake and play games in the billiard room, and he observed all of it with a quiet satisfaction that suggested he understood, if belatedly, what he had been missing. But the family that gathered at Gull Lake was already damaged in ways that a beautiful house could not repair. In 1913, 12 years before the cottage was completed, Will Keith's grandson, Kenneth, had fallen from a window. The boy survived, but sustained permanent disabilities that would require care for the rest of his life. Watching Kenneth and watching the needs of so many other children who lacked the resources to get proper support affected Will Keith profoundly. In 1930, at the height of the Great Depression, he established the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Over his lifetime, he would donate $66 million to it, representing 54% of his Kellogg company stock. The foundation funded schools for disabled children, built hospitals and clinics, trained nurses and doctors, and fed children whose parents had nothing during the worst years of the economic collapse. When asked about this giving, Will Keith rejected any suggestion of saintliness. "I am a selfish person and no philanthropist," he said. "I love to do things for children because I get a kick out of it." In 1925, the same year the cottage was completed, Will Keith fired his son, John Leonard. John Leonard had worked for the company for 17 years. He had invented the wax paper lining that kept cereal fresh inside the box. He had developed all bran. He held more than 200 patents. By every professional measure, he was the heir the company needed. But he had divorced his wife and married his secretary. He had also purchased an oatmeal company, which his father interpreted as a direct act of competitive betrayal. Will Keith Kellogg, who had spent 25 years enduring his brother's contempt, could not tolerate what he perceived as disloyalty from his own son. He cut John Leonard out of the company and out of his life. Father and son did not speak again. In 1937, doctors diagnosed Will Keith with glaucoma. The disease progressed rapidly. Within a few years, he was completely blind. He continued attending board meetings at the company. He still visited the factory floor guided by German Shepherd dogs descended from the famous Rin Tin Tin line. When his directors recommended cutting the advertising budget during a difficult stretch, he overruled them and ordered a $1 million increase. He had learned the value of advertising at the beginning of everything, and he had not forgotten it. Then in 1938, his grandson, John Jr., the young man he had selected as the company's next generation of leadership after cutting off John Leonard, suffered a mental breakdown following a demotion and took his own life. By the end, both of Will Keith's surviving sons had broken off contact with their father entirely. The man who had built a company feeding millions of American families had lost his own. The man who had once been dismissed as the dim one, the overlooked one, the one who sold brooms while his brother went to medical school, he had won everything and lost everyone. Will Keith Kellogg had built a company that fed millions of American families. He had given away most of his fortune to help children he would never meet, and he had managed in the process to lose almost everyone in his own family. Epilogue. The letter, the graves, and the signature. In 1943, John Harvey Kellogg was dying. He was 91 years old. The Battle Creek Sanitarium, the institution he had built into the most famous health resort in America, had gone bankrupt a decade earlier. The Seventh-day Adventist Church had expelled him back in 1907 over theological disputes, cutting him off from the religious community that had shaped his entire identity and funded his education. The presidents and industrialists and celebrities who had once filled his wards were long gone. The enema machines and vibrating chairs and yogurt treatments had passed from medical practice into historical curiosity. The great health reformer faced his final days with far less of the glory he had spent a lifetime accumulating. He thought about his brother. 37 years had passed since Will Keith walked out of the sanitarium to start his own company. 23 years had passed since the Michigan Supreme Court stripped John Harvey of the right to use his own family name on cereal products. The brothers had barely spoken in all that time. Every meeting between them had required a third party present at Will Keith's insistence. The hatred had set into something that felt from the outside permanent. But death has a way of loosening what time has hardened. John Harvey picked up a pen and wrote a letter. In it, he admitted what he had never acknowledged while he was healthy and powerful and celebrated. He had treated Will Keith badly. He had taken him for granted. He had failed across decades of close daily contact to recognize what his younger brother was actually contributing. He was sorry. The word must have cost him something significant, given how rarely it had crossed his lips in the direction of the man who had run alongside his bicycle. The letter arrived at Will Keith's home. Will Keith was 83 years old and completely blind. Someone would have had to read it to him. He chose not to have it read. The envelope sat sealed. On December 14, 1943, John Harvey Kellogg died of bronchitis. He was 91 years old. Only after his brother was dead did Will Keith finally ask someone to read him the letter. What he felt in that moment, nobody recorded. Perhaps he felt regret that he had waited. Perhaps he felt a cold satisfaction that his brother had finally, however, privately acknowledged the truth. Perhaps he felt the particular hollowness that comes with receiving an apology that can no longer lead anywhere, that can be heard but not answered, accepted but not used. There is a version of that moment in which Will Keith Kellogg wept. There is another in which he sat completely still and felt nothing at all. The historical record does not say. Some things that happen between brothers stay between brothers, even when one of them is already gone. Will Keith Kellogg lived 8 more years. He remained involved with the company. He continued his work with the foundation. He died quietly in October of 1951 at the age of 91, the same age his brother had reached. Oak Hill Cemetery sits on a gentle slope in Battle Creek, Michigan. Among its graves lie Sojourner Truth, the abolitionist and women's rights activist who made Battle Creek her home, and C.W. Post, the serial entrepreneur who had learned from the sanitarium and made himself a fortune. And here side by side rest the Kellogg brothers. John Harvey Kellogg, Will Keith Kellogg. 2 headstones, 2 names. One family that spent the better part of a century at war with itself. In death, they lie closer than they allowed themselves to be in their final decades of life. The sanitarium where it all began no longer exists in the form John Harvey created. The grand building served as a military hospital during World War II, then a federal center. The patients stopped coming long ago. The treatments John Harvey developed are remembered now as artifacts from a stranger era of American medicine. But the cottage at Gull Lake still stands. The Tudor manor where Will Keith watched his grandchildren play and screened silent films in the evenings has been preserved. Students and researchers from Michigan State University walk the grounds where the serial king once planted fully grown trees because he had spent too much of his life waiting and had no patience left for saplings. And the signature endures. Every morning in kitchens across America and around the world, people reach for boxes bearing the name that Will Keith Kellogg wrote by hand over a century ago and placed on the front of his product as a personal promise. They pour cornflakes into bowls without thinking about the brothers who invented them. The decades of humiliation that preceded the invention. The courtroom battles over who owned the family name. The unopened letter sitting on a table in Michigan while an old blind man decided one final time to make his brother wait. Will Keith Kellogg feared at 24 that he would always be a poor man. He was wrong about that. He became one of the wealthiest men in America. He gave away $66 million to help children he would never meet. He built a company that still feeds millions every morning. But he was right about something else. As a boy, he never learned to play. And as a man, he never learned to forgive. The letter from his dying brother sat unopened until it was too late. The reconciliation that might have come never did. The brothers are together now in the Michigan earth, their graves just feet apart. The war over the Kellogg name is finally over.